Mr. Booker leads on infrastructure and large-scale capital projects. He serves the Hong Kong government, developers, and investors. More broadly, Simon also serves government clients and statutory bodies throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And prior to that, Simon worked for the British government, where he was responsible for the delivery of major infrastructure projects, including London Heathrow Terminal 5 and high-speed rail. Simon co-chairs the International Infrastructure Committee for the British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong and is a regular speaker on infrastructure delivery. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Booker.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It really is my pleasure to be speaking with you as part of this conference today. Very honored for the invitation. Thank you. I'd like to spend this session really to discuss some of my perspectives on delivering net zero, but specifically with regards to a lens which applies through funding and commercial considerations. So with that in mind, I shall really address four things. I'd like to spend a few minutes really discussing the context to net zero in the infrastructure sector. I'll then move into funding considerations for net zero more generally, and then we'll take the time to dive down in a little bit more detail on what the commercial and funding considerations might look like in practice. And then, if I may, I will leave you with 4 or 5 recommendations which would be food for thought in terms of how we as infrastructure practitioners can promote infrastructure that delivers net zero in Hong Kong. So if I may begin with some observations on the relevance of net zero to us as an infrastructure group. Decarbonizing infrastructure is essential to delivering our net zero ambitions. 60% of emissions, GHG emissions, come from infrastructure, the various asset classes that make up the infrastructure group. And if we look at future emissions, around 70% of our future emissions will come from infrastructure which is in the pipeline, but actually not yet developed. So as infrastructure practitioners, I think we bear a very heavy responsibility to deliver to our stakeholders, to society, to our government, regulators, to our investors and the lenders that we carry with us in the development of infrastructure. Just localizing that discussion a little bit in terms of Hong Kong. And what are we doing here in Hong Kong? This will be familiar to all of you, I'm sure, listening today. But in terms of our climate action plan reaching out to 2050, we really have 4 cornerstones to our strategy. And I'll just spend a minute just reflecting on them, really as context to what I'm about to say. But obviously we're focused on energy. We're focused on ceasing coal by 2035 and increasing the supply of zero carbon energy in the mix to around 60 to 70%. We're also looking at ways to boost renewable energy in the fuel mix up to about 10%. We're also very, very heavily focused on energy efficiency and green buildings. We have committed to electricity consumption reduction targets of around 20% for commercial real estate and around 15% for residential. We also have a very clear lens on green transport. We're looking to reduce vehicle emissions to 0 by 2050. And we also have a clear focus on waste reduction. So we're all preparing for the implementation of waste charging by 2023. And we have a focus on waste to energy facilities, which are being developed through public-private partnerships here in Hong Kong. But I think in our view, just to summarize that debate, those priorities, in terms of the infrastructure environment. And I think in our view, we probably have around 4 infrastructure asset classes where investment is going to be needed in Hong Kong so that we can meet our net zero targets and obligations. Energy, I've just discussed, real focus on low carbon generation technologies, buildings and industry, how we can focus on industrial carbon capture, and residential low carbon heating and energy efficiency. Transport, we've made fantastic steps forward with in Hong Kong around electric vehicle charging infrastructure. But I think also it's worth spending a minute on digital, because I think the opportunity for us here to promote 5G digital infrastructure, data centers, smart meters is intrinsic to our ambition to grow Hong Kong as a world-class smart city. So to assemble the infrastructure required to meet those obligations, to fund that development, is going to require a collaboration, an extensive collaboration between government on the one hand and us as a business community on another. And that, I think, is a great and wonderful opportunity for the business community in Hong Kong to support the government deliver on this agenda. Now, our transition on this net zero journey to achieve net zero in infrastructure, what we can contribute to this agenda as infrastructure practitioners, I would argue begins with funding. There are, of course, 3 steps towards net zero for us as infrastructure practitioners, and it begins with funding and finance on the left-hand side of this screen. It moves to the right in terms of how we decarbonize our infrastructure assets, not just the new ones that we intend to develop, but also the retrofitting of existing infrastructure. And then it moves all the way through to responsible investment, ESG, through the secondary market deal cycle and so forth. But I'm going to spend my time this morning focusing on the left-hand side of this chart on infrastructure finance and how we promote the growth of infrastructure finance in Hong Kong to develop the infrastructure that we need to achieve our net zero targets. And I think in my view, there are 4 key priorities for us to unlock more sustainable infrastructure and direct it to projects that really move us forward to achieve our net zero targets. The first thing is we must have a focus on strategy and program development. We need to identify a pipeline of bankable projects, and we also need to consider how we reform procurement practices, how we commission infrastructure in Hong Kong, make sure that we embed the right criteria, ESG, sustainability metrics in that procurement so that we end up delivering and developing net zero infrastructure across the spectrum. We also must look very closely at our policy and regulatory environment. We need to encourage technological innovation. We need to encourage low-cost green financing, and I will come back to that policy landscape, if I may, shortly. We also need to have a very clear focus on de-risking net zero investments. Government support for early stage and transitional infrastructure is always key. It's always a challenge anywhere in the world. We need to think about solutions to this. We need to identify solutions and unlock green finance across the infrastructure spectrum. And we need to think about new funding models for green infrastructure. And I'll come back to a few examples of that later on, including asset-based financing. And unlocking institutional investment, including MPF funds. But I think there's a wonderful opportunity for us here to embrace net zero, embrace the very, very extensive portfolio of infrastructure projects that the Hong Kong government is now aiming to deliver, to create a regional centre of excellence for Hong Kong in green finance and green infrastructure development and delivery. So, just reflecting on my point of the pipeline of infrastructure projects, we're all aware that, that we have a fantastic opportunity in Hong Kong now to deliver iconic infrastructure that meets the needs of the future and is genuinely sustainable and really delivers on our net zero priorities. Central Waters and the Northern Metropolis are great examples. They are the iconic projects of our time in Hong Kong at the moment. And just those two projects alone could amount to up to 1.6 trillion Hong Kong dollars of investment in terms of the requirement. And we saw this week as well that government were thinking about, you know, the future infrastructure investment landscape in Hong Kong, which could extend up to almost 2.5 trillion over the next 20 years or so. Just to put that into context, that's over 3 times our current fiscal reserve. But the projects themselves are so important and they're so necessary given the macroeconomic context that we face in Hong Kong at the moment. We have an aging population, we have a declining fiscal base, and if you look just at the contribution that the Northern Metropolis could make to that dilemma, 2.5 million additional residents being brought into Hong Kong, that changes the whole macroeconomic and treasury sustainability of the city, and that's why it's so important. But to achieve this, we're going to need innovative funding solutions, and we're going to need more expertise, and a lot of that has to come from the private sector, I would argue. Green and sustainable finance has to play a part in delivering our net zero agenda, these 2 projects specifically. Government has been responding. We've seen huge growth in the green bond market. The issuance volume is growing. We've just seen West Kowloon successfully launch its first sustainability-linked loan. It's not just a first for West Kowloon. It's also, I would argue, the first in the world relating to the arts and cultural sector. So that's 4 billion that's been raised as a facility there, linked directly to the sustainability objectives of the authority. A fantastic achievement. But bonds are not just the only instrument within the portfolio of sustainable finance. Clearly, there are many other tools that can be used. And I won't go into these in detail, but what I will say is that sustainable finance itself brings real advantages to us in terms of delivering and funding infrastructure efficiently and effectively. If we look at the pricing of green bonds relative to the broader bond market, you do see a price differential up to 45 basis points if that bond and the project that it relates to is certified as being green, and that's a very, very important consideration. If it's not certified as green, but it still is under the green bond agenda, I think that pricing differential, the pricing advantage, falls away almost entirely, just around 5 basis points or so. So certification of a project as having legitimate green credentials is fundamental to our financing efficiency. So when we consider projects such as Central Waters, when we consider projects such as Lantau tomorrow, these are once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to transform Hong Kong, to develop truly net zero urban developments. And we must develop a strategy to leverage sustainable finance to support that ambition. So, as I said, the Hong Kong government green bond market has been growing. The government has been actively promoting growth with great success. It's grown considerably in 2021, up from just $8 billion in 2019. But if you look at the green bond market globally, it's still a very small source of funds. About 1% of total bond issuance relates to green bonds. So, you know, it is in its infancy. It presents wonderful opportunity, but it's a small source of funding at the moment. The other challenge that we face in delivering major infrastructure is that the application of these green bonds to early stage infrastructure is always problematic. That's not specific to Hong Kong, it's a global phenomenon. Reclamation particularly, when I'm thinking about Central Waters in my capacity as advising the government on efficient forms of funding and financing for Central Waters, is very challenging. And we need to think about how reclamation and other forms of early stage infrastructure relate to our net zero agenda and the financial instruments that we have available to support that. So early stage and transitional infrastructure is a real challenge. But we need to solve this problem so that the later stage sustainability benefits are unlocked and realized. Currently, a lot of our typical infrastructure funding models don't relate well to issues of reclamation and early stage development. And what we see as a result is the need for multiple refinancings throughout the infrastructure life cycle. And that adds cost, it defeats efficiency, it is very challenging. So what can be done to address some of these practical funding challenges? How can we structure our thinking of the delivery of major infrastructure projects to respond to these challenges? Well, there are a number of potential solutions. The first thing that I would say is we need to have a clear taxonomy for green infrastructure. There is a lack of clarity at the moment around what green development, green infrastructure projects actually look like. And without access to low-cost capital, which, as I've said on my last slide, is unlocked by clarity on the green credentials of a project, then funding and rolling out a very ambitious infrastructure program in Hong Kong is going to be hard and it's going to be expensive. So we have to think about how we can de-risk infrastructure projects that are essential to our ambition to deliver net zero. So providing more clarity around what infrastructure assets are green, looking at how we can address the early stage and transitional infrastructure problems, because they're very much casualties at the moment of this lack of clarity. So we need a green taxonomy. I would suggest that good practice would lead us to a science-based disclosure system. And we need that to tackle the very legitimate concerns of investors around greenwashing. We need to provide clear, solid clarity around the characteristics of infrastructure projects. So if we can do this, if we can achieve that clarity, then there is a pool of capital which is primed to invest in net zero infrastructure. What it needs is the government, for regulators, for stakeholders worldwide to set the vision and the policy framework. And I would offer that for consideration in Hong Kong. Accessing this pool of capital is problematic. But if we look at past successes provide lessons for us in terms of how this efficient capital can be unlocked. We'll all be familiar with offshore wind. It's a great example. It's been supported by very clear government policy directives, and it has therefore successfully unlocked very efficient forms of capital from the private sector. So we need more clarity around that policy landscape, around the agenda, and we must set out a long-term roadmap, setting out a pipeline of those infrastructure projects or components of those infrastructure projects which are essential to our net zero strategy. We do not have that pipeline at the moment, and I don't think we understand how specific projects fit into our net zero ambition. I think the other thing that I would raise for consideration is that government policy can drive more efficient investment in infrastructure. At the moment, we have a very focused, if you like, agenda on the issuance of government bonds to fund infrastructure itself. But if we were to look at some of the problems, some of the characteristics of of infrastructure which is essential to deliver our net zero ambition. Why we're not unlocking funding often relates to uncertainty around the revenue streams generated from these assets themselves. So if there was more support on the revenue side, providing public finance, providing interventions to give more clarity and certainty on the revenues coming out of these projects, we may start to unlock new forms of private capital and really help ourselves to develop Hong Kong as a sustainable infrastructure finance hub. So there is no doubt that more capital could be channeled into net zero infrastructure investment, but it does require enabling. So I think there are 4 key things that I would focus our minds on to unlock and enable efficient capital into net zero infrastructure. The first is strategy and program development. We must have a roadmap of what the important projects are that deliver net zero for us, and crystallize those down into a pipeline of bankable projects that the private sector is capable and interested in to come forward and bring efficient capital and expertise. We must focus on policy and regulations that drive investment into sustainable infrastructure projects. Tax incentives are a great way of extending the attractiveness of projects, and extending tax deductions to qualifying infrastructure investment would be one step. I think we also need to provide more policy guidance for the construction of qualifying infrastructure projects, and by that I mean qualifying as green. What aspects of these projects qualify as green for Lantau tomorrow and for the Northern Metropolis. We also need to focus on how we de-risk parts of those projects as well, how we de-risk the early stage of those projects. And as I said, that could take the form of guarantees, it could take the form of new funding models that focus on de-risking the revenue streams, which could include consideration of asset-based financing, for example, which we've successfully delivered infrastructure worldwide using. And I think from a financing perspective, we all should be focused on how we catalyze sustainable finance and how we really promote the development of this industry in Hong Kong. We should be considering how we extend MPF funds into qualifying sustainable infrastructure assets as a pool of very, very efficient capital, and promoting cross-border infrastructure finance by allowing perhaps some of the listed REITs here in Hong Kong to access mainland capital for sustainable infrastructure purposes. So if I may conclude my presentation by offering you 5 recommendations on how we can direct more efficient and effective funding into infrastructure projects which are critical for the delivery of our net zero ambition in Hong Kong. The first is we must create that detailed roadmap, setting out the level of investment that's needed in infrastructure by asset class. Let's break it down. We could even break individual projects down into components themselves that relate and drive our net zero ambition. We need to detail those qualifying projects or the components of them and communicate them. Let's think about how we can fund and break down major projects like Lantau tomorrow into digestible components that relate to green and sustainable sources of finance. We also need to consider developing revenue support mechanisms. So let's avoid crowding out private sector finance by government bond issues in their entirety as a means of funding infrastructure projects. But let's use these iconic projects themselves instead as an opportunity to develop Hong Kong as a regional center of excellence for green infrastructure finance and development. Let's also work with the private sector through PPPs to accelerate the emerging technologies that we know are so necessary to achieve our net zero goals. Let's promote PPPs to expand the SITP, the Loop, the Hong Kong Science Park, really to unlock and move faster with the delivery of those emerging technology solutions that we know need to be delivered rapidly and rapidly incubated. They will require faster and newer delivery models, and I think PPP has a great role to play there. And then let's also think about how we transform our funding mechanisms. And as I've said today, I think government bonds, green bonds play a very important role. But let's also look beyond that government bond agenda, and let's look to unlock the role of the private sector investment through new mechanisms that really focus in on de-risking the nature of these projects, and particularly the revenue profile that is associated with them. And lastly, let's build clear strategic guidance, setting out very clearly how our investment in net zero is to be managed and funded over the long term. It's not just about the responsibilities of us funding long-term infrastructure today amongst our current population and tax base. It's about thinking of the needs of the future and how we consider that intergenerational funding burden. So with that in mind, I will conclude my presentation. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
It's excellent sharing from Mr. Booker about the financial aspect of the movement towards carbon neutrality. So thanks a lot for that. We have already received a number of questions from the audience. So if you are okay, I can just pick up some of the questions for your continuous education. Hong Kong has gained a long time of a reputation for its infrastructures. You know, for example, it has been recognized by the World Economic Forum for the very top ranking in the past few years. However, the transformation of the infrastructure towards net zero has been also widely recognized not easy. So if we request you to name 3 major challenges we are facing, could you enlighten us on that, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. It's a very very challenging question. I appreciate that. I'd echo the opening statement you made to that comment. I'm always reminded of how efficient and effective Hong Kong's infrastructure is. Whenever I travel overseas and use public and social infrastructure in other cities and countries, Hong Kong has done a fantastic job. And let's be honest, we've delivered this infrastructure over the last 100 years or so in partnership with the government and the private sector, whether that's been education in terms of schools or rail infrastructure, etc. So our track record is incredibly strong. But moving forward, as you say, how do we start to think about the challenges of developing zero carbon infrastructure compared to our previous successes? And I think you alluded to the point of the costs of some of the zero carbon infrastructure projects and whether I imagine they're potentially more expensive. I would say it's not just about the costs. It's about the commercial feasibility of the project, and that would be my first point to your question. We need to look at developing and packaging projects together in a way that make commercial sense to lenders, so that the role of the private sector, the expertise, the efficient capital can be unlocked. So I don't think it's about costs. I think it's about the feasibility, the commercial feasibility of projects. I think the second point I would say is we face a real dilemma with early stage infrastructure. It is very problematic to relate early stage infrastructure to green and sustainable forms of funding. This, I think, should be the focus of our thoughts in terms of the policy landscape in Hong Kong and indeed globally. We need to bridge this either by some form of government intervention or alternative funding and procurement models. I mentioned some of the asset-based financing models that we've used successfully elsewhere. We have to do that, otherwise we're not going to unlock that future value which comes from the operation of the asset itself and how that can deliver the genuine net zero features that we so desire. And I think the last point I'd make, the other key challenge, my point 3, would be this whole certification issue and the need to clarify what we mean by a green project. There is huge uncertainty in the market at the moment around the green credentials, what makes a green project, for example. But if we can solve that, we can access such a fantastic pool of capital on more efficient terms. So I think those 3 points I would raise in response to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the summary, and that's very, very useful. Probably we also got time for a very quick technical question. Hong Kong's construction is dominated by the use of concrete and cement. And cement is absolutely a major dominator of carbon emissions, embodied carbon in particular. Do you have any strategy for the investment in concrete and cement in the future towards decarbonization?
I'm afraid it's not something that I'm a deep expert in. My sort of comment on that would be that, it is the cement industry, amongst all of the emissions from the infrastructure asset classes overall, I think the cement industry accounts for around 10%. So it's very, very fundamental.
Yeah.
So we have to find ways of solving that problem. Now, I imagine, and I would defer to you and your members on this point, I imagine the answer lies in engineering and construction solutions and technology, and modularization of buildings so that we move away from that sort of carbon-intense, cement-driven model of construction into some of the other forms of rapid and low, if you like, emission technology, such as modular buildings and so forth, that could really help us to move things forward there. So that would be the only comment I would add there.
That's absolutely. So once again, thanks a lot, Mr. Booker.
Thank you. You're very welcome. Thank you very much.